Since slavery is already a form of rape, using a person's body for your own purposes, it was even more so for African American women who face the direct threat of sexual assault constantly. And on top of that, something even more heinous. The slave master would often force a male slave to rape a female slave to produce what he considered an ideal offspring. And of course, pedophilia was rampant as well. Harriet Jacobs' master was a pedophile. But it wasn't even this that led her to run away. It was for the sake of her children who he threatened to brutalize. It often isn't even upon the individual that makes slavery so horrifying, but rather upon the family and close bonds we have with each other. Ripping people apart, seeing a loved one murdered, and of course it goes without saying with no justice. Seeing a loved one raped, and then the next morning bowing your head to the same person who murdered or raped your children. We are still in this boat today, with people honoring rapists like Thomas Jefferson. Black history can be uncomfortable, just because of how much human suffering there was. But you don't have to approach it with white fragility. I was thinking of a comedic skit with Bill Burr, where he said he was watching Roots, and he gets that his ancestors were despicable. Now, I don't really like Bill Burr, and this is part of the reason why, besides him being, seems to me, an apologist for racists and misogynists. Why would you ever see that and feel culpable? Why not say instead, I get it, this is horrible? I might be reading too far into things, but when he says my ancestors were horrible, he sounds almost as if he feels personally attacked. The reason I don't think I am is because we do honor slave owners, and the inevitable question is why. Bill Burr anticipates this question, but he doesn't follow through with its logical conclusion. If your ancestors are horrible, why do we honor them with statues, holidays, and memorials? Instead, he goes on to complain about films featuring black athletes or something. People who defended the Confederate flag weren't wrong to say activists will go after Thomas Jefferson next, because if it is wrong to honor Confederates, and it is, why honor slave owners and rapists like Jefferson? You could argue he never went to war to defend slavery, and that the Confederacy existed at a time when slavery was much more apparently wrong. Not exactly true. Jefferson himself was against slavery, and he knew it was wrong, and continued to practice it while still raping his slave. There are much better people to honor who advocated for freedom without hypocrisy. There might not be anybody who is perfect, but there are better and worse people, and if we are to honor anybody, it should be the best of us, like Douglass or Malcolm X or Harriet Jacobs or Ida B. Wells. I'm not against these heroes. I think it's important to have people upheld in our society and remembered for their good deeds to inspire the next generation. The problem is that who we are honoring are not the best of us. For me, criticizing these individuals was never a problem. I was never brought into the indoctrination of our culture. Our society speaks out of both sides of its mouth. On the one hand, a person will say, these people are not gods. They were not perfect. They were men of their time. And yet these same individuals who say all these things will have no problem having statues of these men or suggesting they advanced freedom in some significant way. That could have been true. A person can be great in one respect and bad in another. It's simply not true, however, for the Founding Fathers. The horror of having turned out like Canada. Marx thought the United States was spectacular because it didn't have a monarchy or an official religion. But England, who we broke from, didn't have one in practice. It's true England probably would be better without a monarchy because it serves no function. It's like wisdom teeth. Yet it has no real political power either, and therefore doesn't to any extent affect the lives very much of the average citizen. Certainly not enough to justify a revolution. You could argue that the Founding Fathers couldn't vote, but I don't believe a war for freedom can be justified if there is significant hypocrisy. Otherwise, you'd have to argue that all wars are for the betterment of some portion of humanity, even if it's just for one individual like a king. When a war is fought for the betterment of yourself, you're not a hero, and the founding fathers were simply fighting for themselves. Whereas in, say, the Civil War, a whole race of people was being liberated. Only rich white men in the Revolution had their lives somewhat improved, and since they were rich and living in a white supremacist nation, the question pops up, improved to what extent? And it wasn't the rich white man, but the poor white man who suffered in most of the battles. Washington was a general, not a foot soldier. The Revolution really wasn't a war for freedom any more than the conquest of Persia by Alexander. Rather, it was a vain grab for more power by already exceptionally powerful men. To get back to Burr, I think it's also telling that all he seemed to extrapolate from history was that white people are bad. He can't seem to think of the slaves themselves, only the guilt he feels, and the way in which he personally feels connected to the people doing the abuse, and not the humanity of the slave. First and foremost, when watching or reading about slavery, you should feel associated with the slave and consider how horrible the slave master was. Not think of him as your ancestor, as if that term means anything. We're all human beings. We're all related. We're all the same species. And what connects people is not our race, but our sentience. What Bill Burr should have said was, how cruel are these sociopaths? What's wrong with these sociopaths? Instead, he's alarmed that his ancestor is so cruel. And he seems to feel a sense of guilt or shame instead of anger. And I think whenever somebody shows guilt or instead of anger when learning about slavery, reveals how they identify and how much emphasis they place on race in terms of their identity and how they approach the world. But enough with that digression. Something else that's interesting in Harriet Jacobs is her description of religion, which slave masters used to keep the slaves in line through constant repetition of the verses justifying slavery. Again, I'm always amused by the stupidity of modern conservatives who take the literal interpretation of the Bible until it becomes inconvenient. They'll lambast liberals for cherry picking, but then do so themselves at the drop of the hat. But doesn't that open the floodgates? If you can interpret one part, why not another? You may argue that the parts regarding slavery are open to interpretation, but not others. Yet are we really going to say that slavery should otherwise be justified if we couldn't find a convenient way of interpreting that passage and ignore the evidence that it is from God's other great creation, the earth, and the creatures who suffer in it? Harriet Jacobs' description of religion of the slave owners really shows how it became a tool of suppression, since all they ever used it for was keeping slaves in line. Meanwhile, it was common for slave owners to laugh at a grieving mother whose children had died or were sold and tell them openly that their children had no souls and that there would be no afterlife for black people. Again, when I reiterate these stories, I don't feel personally guilty or ashamed. They aren't my ancestors. I have no sense of identity with these people. I trace my lineage not genetically. Homo sapiens are one of the most genetically related animals on the planet, but intellectually, through a sort of people's history of the world. The Gracchus brothers, Spartacus, Jesus, Muhammad, Mary Wollstonecraft, Douglas, Garrison, John Brown, anybody who fought to make the world a better place. These are my kin. In short, I see myself as American, not white. Or even more broadly, maybe I should say, as a sentient creature that can suffer. One of the things, the great tragedies among all the others for slave women, was seeing their children whipped, sold, or killed and not being able to do anything about it. Harriet Jacobs had desired for her child to die. Upon hearing her children were to be sold, Harriet ran away herself in the hopes that doing so would prevent their sale. They were sold to punish her, but by running away, it gave first the impression she did not care about them, and also running away meant that they needed another slave on their plantation to replace her. The craft of running away developed into an intricate art form involving secret compartments inside of homes in which free slaves and abolitionists would hide fugitives. Harriet had to remain in the vicinity of her plantation, since no safe passage north could be immediately found. But Harriet used as much cunning as any person could to deceive those pursuing her. It was a game of cat and mouse, which would eventually end in the victory of the slaves and the destruction of the South. Harriet went so far as to send a letter up north and have it mailed to her former master to make it believe she was nearby. Her former enslaver was also deceptive, since when he received the letter, he rewrote it so that when reading it to all the slaves on the plantation, he made it sound like freedom was no different than destitution. This is a prime example of why we can't assume all slave owners were men of their time, since it's obvious by slaves running away and frequently killing themselves that slavery was wrong. But the slave owners ignored these facts. What's the need to chain up slaves if you didn't know they didn't want to work for you? Harriet Jacob says as much regarding Senator Albert Galatian Brown of Mississippi. Don't be too quick to excuse and defend people like Washington or Jefferson. They very well could have known better. Another reason I think slave owners knew better is because they could have just asked their slave about their condition. The same close proximity that allowed slave owners like Jefferson to rape their slaves could very well have aroused their curiosity to ask the slaves how they felt about being chained up and whipped all day, if it wasn't obvious to begin with. Harriet Jacob talks about a mistress she knew who wanted a slave woman to be buried near her, and the slaves objected to this, wanting, of course, for their kin to be buried near them. She was saddened by this, but she didn't ask, though it must have been a great mystery to her as to why. Or perhaps she knew, as I suspect, and suppressed the thought that these were human beings with familial connections. Harriet Jacobs does finally escape north on board the ship of a white abolitionist and makes it to New York. But the North was just as racist as the South would be in the 1960s, with many of the same Jim Crow laws. In fact, she uses the term Jim Crow. And while thankful, of course, to have escaped slavery, she had not been so robbed of her dignity as to submit to this kind of treatment. This would, of course, be the fight for the next century waged by people like Du Bois, Ida B. Wells, Malcolm X, and Angela Davis. And still, of course, there are remnants today that we are still fighting.